They say spring in Chicago is a fickle beast, a moody teenager of a season. One moment, the sun glints off the high-rises. The next, the sky turns a bruised purple. Ethan learned this the hard way. The morning had started with a clear, sharp light as he left his apartment. But by the time he reached the elevated train platform, fat, heavy drops of rain began to fall. A low rumble of thunder echoed between the canyons of steel and glass, and the downpour intensified, sheeting against the windows of the arriving train. Inside the packed car, a chorus of complaints rose above the screech of the rails. People griped about forgotten umbrellas, the inevitable Monday gridlock, the certainty of being late. Ethan, clutching his laptop bag, found himself wedged between a group of commuters whose morning chatter grated on his nerves. He gripped a distant pole, struggling for balance as the train lurched. Condensation fogged the windows, sealing them inside a humid, metallic box, amplifying the collective mood of irritation. After the fourth time a woman's grocery bag slammed into his leg with no apology offered, Ethan took a deep, steadying breath and squeezed his way toward the less crowded rear of the car. He made a frantic dash from the station to his office building, the rain plastering his hair to his scalp and soaking through his shirt. He managed to clock in with a minute to spare. Walking into his department, breathless and looking like a drowned rat, he was met with a round of good-natured jeers from his colleagues. Chloe, the girl in the cubicle next to him, tossed a small towel over the partition. He caught it with a murmur of profound gratitude. She told him not to mention it, just to dry off quickly. They were about to be late for a meeting. Ethan froze, confused about what meeting she meant. Chloe explained that their director, Joyce, had tagged him in a team-wide message the night before. The due diligence teams for the VD acquisition were in today for the kickoff. He fumbled for his phone, scrolling through the muted department channel. There it was, a notification sent at 12:05 a.m. by Joyce Sterling, the CFO. It informed him that he would be replacing a colleague named Wong in the 9:10 a.m. kickoff meeting in Conference Room 1 with the buyer's team. He cursed internally. Who sends a work summons after midnight and expects it to be seen? He glanced at Joyce's closed office door and asked Chloe where she was. Chloe's voice was tinged with a faint, pitying sympathy as she informed him that Joyce had gone to the conference room ages ago. There was no more time for quiet resentment. Ethan grabbed a notepad from his bag, not even bothering to finish drying his hair, and bolted from his desk. The door to Conference Room 1 was slightly ajar. Through the heavily frosted glass, he could see the blurred shapes of a room already full of people. Steeling himself, he pushed the door open. His damp, slicked-down hair and his shirt, darkened to a deep navy by the rain, earned him more than a few surprised glances. Worse, the CEO and the other department heads were already seated around the massive mahogany table. Ethan had to endure their subtle, appraising stares as he made his way to an empty seat beside a stone-faced Joyce Sterling. He began to offer a quiet apology about the rain and the traffic. She cut him off with a curt dismissal, stating there were no excuses, her eyes fixed on her laptop screen. She didn't spare him a single glance. Ethan fell silent, a familiar sense of powerlessness washing over him. He said no more, opened his own laptop, and began to silently read through his emails. A few minutes later, once everyone seemed to be settled, a young man at the head of the opposite side of the table stood up. He smiled at the assembled group and announced that since time was getting on, he would begin the introductions. He presented himself as Jason, the investment director from VD Company. He then gestured to the people on his left, identifying them as the financial, tax, and legal teams for the due diligence process. A flurry of business cards and handshakes followed. Ethan paid little attention. This had very little to do with him. His company's overseas parent had been trying to sell off its domestic operations for the past 2 years, and this was the third potential buyer to come through. Landing a deal with a biotech giant like VD was a major coup, and the company's leadership was treating the process with utmost seriousness. Joyce would be handling all financial liaisons personally. He was just here to take notes and fill a seat. When Jason introduced the legal team from Sterling and Locke, a ripple of interest went through the room. A young woman named Anna stood to distribute her cards. She was undeniably striking, with a poised self-assurance that even Ethan, as a gay man, could appreciate. After she introduced the 2 other women on her team, Jason looked puzzled. He recalled that her team was supposed to have 4 members present. Anna smiled apologetically, explaining that their 4th member had just returned from a business trip in the States the day before and was currently stuck in traffic coming from the airport. The room murmured with understanding. The city's traffic was notoriously unforgiving. As if on cue, a soft knock sounded at the door before it was pushed open. A young man in a trench coat, pulling a sleek, metallic carry-on suitcase, strode into the room. He placed the suitcase against the wall and turned to face them. A handsome, clean-cut face broke into a disarmingly warm smile. He apologized for his tardiness, blaming the traffic. He introduced himself as Ken Leong from Sterling and Locke. Ethan stared, his eyes wide with disbelief. The phone in his hand nearly slipped from his grasp. Half an hour had passed since the CEO had begun his overview of the company. By the time he concluded, Ethan hadn't absorbed a single word. His mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. He stared blankly at the projection screen, his peripheral vision fixed on the young man sitting on the other side of the table. To run into a classmate he hadn't seen in 7 years in a setting like this should have been a pleasant surprise, a testament to the strange workings of fate. But for Ethan, it was infinitely more complicated. He couldn't articulate the feeling, only that it was like chewing on a handful of raw coffee beans. Bitter, astringent, yet sparking a nervous, thrilling energy that made him tremble. The conference room was dim, the lights lowered for the presentation. Even so, Ethan found himself tracking Ken's every move. Ken listened intently to the operations overview, occasionally leaning over to whisper something to Anna, his fingers tapping intermittently on his keyboard. Even in the near darkness, Ethan felt he could picture Ken's expression perfectly. The first sight of him after all these years confirmed it. He hadn't changed at all. But what about me? Ethan's brow furrowed. A sudden, sharp pang of inadequacy tightened its grip around his heart. Ken's clear, pleasant voice cut through the presentation. He apologized for the interruption but had a few questions regarding the verbal agreements with suppliers that had just been mentioned. Ethan felt a familiar pull. Ken had always possessed a kind of magnetic field that drew everyone's attention. His every action was observed with a quiet admiration. Even now, he projected an air of scholarly poise combined with a rigorous scientific logic. A thought struck Ethan. In high school, Ken had been a science prodigy, a star on the math Olympiad team. How had he ended up in a law firm? Ken had felt a persistent gaze on him for some time. He was used to being watched in professional settings, but this particular stare felt different, more intense. After concluding his exchange with the operations director, he casually glanced across the table. The dim lighting made it impossible to identify the source of the unsettling focus. Ethan's reverie was shattered by Joyce at his side. She turned to him abruptly, her voice a low, cold command. She instructed him to take notes on what the director had just said, as the finance team would likely request related documents later. Ethan's heart, which had been floating in a nostalgic haze, was yanked back to the harsh reality of the present. He wanted to groan. He hadn't heard a thing. He should have set his phone to record. But under Joyce's icy stare, he could only angle his laptop away from her prying eyes and frantically start typing keywords he could barely recall. His silent, fumbling attempt must have aroused her suspicion. Joyce frowned and pulled his laptop towards her. As she started to add a point herself, she saw the screen. It was mostly blank, save for a few scattered, unrelated words. Ethan felt the floor drop out from under him, the familiar shame of a student caught unprepared by a teacher. But this was worse. Leaving such a disastrous impression on his rigid, unforgiving superior meant the days ahead would be difficult. Joyce said nothing more, but her silent condemnation was more chilling than any reprimand. Ethan felt as if he'd been plunged into ice water. He pushed all thoughts of Ken from his mind and forced himself to focus, listening with anxious intensity as the executives continued their presentations. When the meeting finally adjourned and the lights came back on, Ethan looked to Joyce, hoping for some instruction. She ignored him completely, standing up to speak with the visiting finance team. His spirits plummeted. Overwhelmed by a sense of failure and frustration, he didn't even notice someone approaching him from behind. A hesitant voice called his name. Ken sounded uncertain. From across the table, Ethan's face had been partially obscured by his laptop screen, and his entire demeanor seemed different from the person Ken remembered. Still, the potential reward of reconnecting far outweighed the minor embarrassment of being mistaken. Ethan's back went rigid. His first instinct was to flee. Ken pressed on, asking if he remembered him. Ethan turned, looking up at the man standing over him. He manufactured a perfectly calibrated expression of excited surprise. He claimed it really was him, that he'd been staring, afraid he was mistaken. Of course, he remembered his old classmate. Ken seemed to relax, a small smile playing on his lips as he adjusted his glasses. He remarked that he felt he hadn't changed much. Ethan stood, countering that Ken looked much better than before, so much so that he had almost failed to recognize him. For a moment, they met each other's eyes on equal footing, and the bustling room seemed to fall silent. A teasing female voice broke the spell. Anna had walked over, a playful glint in her eye. She had overheard, she said, and asked if they knew each other. Ken's face lit up. He explained that Ethan was his classmate from elementary and high school, and that they hadn't seen each other in years. Ethan added that it was an incredible coincidence. He mentioned a grade school reunion a couple of years back that Ken hadn't attended, joking that they had all assumed he'd emigrated and was living a life of decadent capitalism abroad. Ken laughed, explaining that his university course load and internship commitments had been too demanding to allow for a trip back. He then recalled that Ethan had also studied abroad. Ethan confirmed this, clarifying that he had returned home right after his undergraduate degree and had been working at this company's finance department for over 2 years. A flicker of confusion crossed Ken's face, but his good manners prevented him from prying. He simply shifted the conversation to his own recent experiences. Anna listened for a while before laughingly interrupting. She chided Ken for portraying himself as a mere wage slave, pointing out that his global pay package made their firm look like a sweatshop by comparison. Ethan glanced at her, recognizing the unabashed pride in her tone. He remembered a time when he, too, had spoken of Ken with that same involuntary boastfulness. Sterling and Locke was a multinational firm. For Ken to command an international salary at his age spoke volumes of his brilliance. He was exactly as Ethan had imagined he would become: successful, flawless, and genuinely kind. For some reason, Ethan was suddenly thrown back to the day they had met again after being placed in the same class in their sophomore year of high school. Ken had been putting down his pen, pinching the bridge of his nose. At Ethan's casual greeting, he had looked up, his bright eyes crinkling with a smile. "Hey buddy," Ethan had said. "Remember me?" The tax team was being incredibly nitpicky. Chloe let out a theatrical groan from her cubicle, complaining that they were demanding documents the finance team had already provided. She gestured to a towering stack of receipts, lamenting that they wanted to review every single one, making the process as tedious as a full-blown audit. Ethan, spinning a pen between his fingers while texting, casually told her to get used to it. This wasn't her first due diligence rodeo. Chloe retorted that previous reviews hadn't been taken this seriously. They could usually brush off repetitive requests. But this time, she mimicked Joyce's stern tone. They were to provide everything requested, meticulously and without error, and all questions were to be directed to Joyce herself. The pressure was immense. It felt like they were expected to prostrate themselves before VD. Another colleague from the front row chimed in, agreeing that landing a deal with a notoriously generous acquirer like VD meant they had to be on their best behavior. Then, she shifted topics, remarking that the guy who came by for documents earlier was quite a looker. In a finance department that was 80% female, with a significant portion of them single. The rare appearance of a young, well-dressed professional from outside the company was always a topic of intense interest. Ethan's own good looks had initially made him popular, but his sarcastic, introverted nature soon dulled his appeal, and he was relegated to being just another face. Chloe scoffed at her colleague's taste, questioning if a man barely 5'7" could be considered handsome. The other woman defended her position, arguing that in this day and age, a handsome face was a rare commodity, regardless of height. Chloe declared her standards were higher and held out her phone, telling her to look at something truly fresh off the press. The colleague gasped, proclaiming the man in the photo to be exactly her type. The photo, she learned, was a candid shot taken by someone in the legal department downstairs. Apparently, the women on the visiting legal team were stunning as well. Ethan's spinning pen stopped dead. He looked up and asked to see the picture. Chloe and the other woman were still fawning over the image and teased him for wanting to see the male lawyer's photo, jokingly asking if he was gay. He was. After a dry cough, Ethan warned them to keep their voices down, mentioning he thought he saw Joyce get up. The two women instantly scurried back to their desks. Ethan persisted, rolling his chair over to Chloe's cubicle. He claimed he was just curious, that he hadn't thought the guy was all that handsome during the meeting and wanted to see if he'd misremembered. His blatant lie about questioning Ken's looks provoked a strong reaction from Chloe. She accused him of being blind and shoved the phone in his face, telling him to look closer. Ethan opened the image. It was a remarkably vivid, candid shot. The subject was turned halfway, speaking to someone. He had turned his head as if someone else had called his name, a smile gracing his lips at the exact moment the photo was taken. Ethan forwarded the picture to himself before handing the phone back. Chloe asked for his verdict. Ethan calmly replied that yes, he had misremembered the man's face. Chloe was triumphant, asking if he wasn't even more handsome in person. Ethan agreed that he was handsome enough to be friendless. Just then, his own phone buzzed. It was a message from the handsome man himself. Ken asked if he wanted to get dinner after work. Ethan messaged back, questioning if Ken was sure he wouldn't have to work late. Ken retorted, asking if Ethan was sure he wouldn't be the one working late. Ethan replied that if even he had to work overtime, it meant their department was truly on its last legs. Ken nearly choked on his coffee. Anna looked at him with a mixture of concern and suspicion. Ken just waved his hand, still trying to suppress a laugh, and told her it was nothing before forwarding her a contract they had just received. The afternoon flew by. Ken sent off one email and immediately began composing another. He informed the rest of his team that he had forwarded the documents they needed. A junior associate on his team joked about his high efficiency making her look lazy. Ken just smiled, his focus already back on the screen. Anna, ever perceptive, noticed his unusual intensity. She asked if he had plans for the evening. When he didn't register her question, she repeated it, teasing him for working so hard he had forgotten to even drink water. Ken finally looked up, raised an eyebrow, and took a long drink from his glass, his sense of humor returning. He thanked her for the reminder. Anna laughed and then casually asked if he had a date with a special someone that evening. Ken seemed amused by the phrase. He shook his head, explaining that he had made plans to have dinner with his old classmate from the morning meeting. He then asked if she was about to tell him they had to work overtime on their very first day. Anna's expression relaxed. She leaned back in her chair and told him she'd let him off the hook this once. She asked what time they were meeting, impressed by how much work he had accomplished in a single afternoon. At 6 o'clock, Ken checked his watch and announced he was heading out. As he was packing up and putting on his coat, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan, apologizing. His mom needed him to come home early. Could they reschedule? Ken's movements slowed. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly parted as if to say something. Finally, just before the screen went dark, he typed a single word. Okay. Seeing the short reply, Ethan felt a suspended, hollow feeling in his chest finally settle. But as it landed, it stirred up a cloud of dust, leaving his mind murky and unsettled. He packed his things, said his usual goodbyes, and seeing that the rain had stopped, walked out of the office alone. The evening rush hour was at its peak. Ethan lived far from the city center, and it was nearly 7:30 by the time he got home. His mother was on the sofa, eating from a bowl while watching a soap opera on television. 2 plates of simple leftovers sat on the dining table. Ethan went through his routine, washing his hands, changing his clothes, and then getting a bowl of rice from the kitchen. He sat at the table and quickly finished his meal. On the TV, a melodramatic family argument was reaching its climax. His mother was completely absorbed, oblivious to the rice she was dropping on the floor. Ethan couldn't help but say something. He gently suggested that she should eat first, then watch TV. She grunted in acknowledgement but made no move, clearly not having registered his words. Normally, he would have let it go. He was used to these small, daily frustrations. But for some reason, tonight, a wave of irritation rose in his chest. He spoke again, his voice firmer, telling her to either eat her dinner properly or put the bowl down and watch her show. His mother frowned, telling him she knew what she was doing. Suddenly, Ethan slammed his bowl down, went to the kitchen for a broom, and began sweeping up the mess at her feet. His tall frame completely blocked the television. His mother's temper flared. She demanded to know what he was doing and told him to eat his dinner and leave her alone. He shot back, asking if she remembered how she used to lecture him as a child for spilling food, for watching TV during meals. His eyes caught new stains on the fabric sofa, and he pointed them out, asking how she could stand the filth. His mother slammed her own bowl down on the coffee table. Her voice rose sharp and accusatory. Was he lecturing her now? She challenged him to find another household where a son dared to lecture his mother. She sarcastically suggested that since he was the big shot earning a fortune downtown, she was expected to keep the house pristine and have a hot meal waiting for him. Sensing another pointless argument brewing, Ethan swallowed the rest of his words. He listened in silence as his mother launched into a familiar tirade of grievances. sweeping the floor clean before returning to the table to finish his own meal. She sneered, telling him to just leave the dishes, that she would wash them. He ignored her, carried his and her dishes to the sink, washed them all, and then retreated to his room without another word. His phone had several new messages. It was Ken, sending pictures from a sushi restaurant near their office, remarking that it was quite good. Ethan glanced at the artfully arranged photos, his face impassive. He texted back a dry comment about the nice photography and color grading. Ken replied a moment later that his female colleague had taken them. They were all very talented. Ethan sent back an emoji and tossed his phone aside. He had impulsively agreed to dinner with Ken, only to just as impulsively invent an excuse to cancel at the last minute. He didn't know what he was thinking. The person he had thought about, dreamed about, for more than 7 years was finally here. But now that he was real, Ethan felt like the monkey in the fable, reaching for the moon's reflection in the water. He was afraid that if he reached out, the beautiful image would shatter. Ethan had never been a lucky person. Raffles always ended with a thank you for participating, his luggage got lost at airports, his college roommate had been a nightmare, his first boyfriend had cheated on him, and he had bombed his SATs. If there was a god of fortune, that deity would not dare show its face to Ethan for fear of a beating. So perhaps this time, fate decided to throw him a small bone. When Ken messaged to say he was being suddenly reassigned to another city to fix a disastrously failing project, Ethan wasn't sure what to feel. He had spent all night mentally preparing himself to face Ken again, even dressing with extra care that morning. But just like that, the anticipated encounter was indefinitely postponed. He felt both relieved and vaguely disappointed. The next few days passed with no contact between them. Their relationship was that of long-lost classmates, not friends. Without the opportunity for an in-person meeting, there was no reason for casual conversation. Ethan figured that was probably the end of it. Besides, his week was already going poorly. He was bogged down with frustrating tasks at work, and he came home one evening to his mother's decree that he would be going on a blind date that weekend. Ethan had no interest in women, and his already strained relationship with his mother meant the discussion quickly devolved into another fight. The small stresses of life were like a spider's web, not heavy but sticky and entangling, gradually making it impossible to struggle free. And just like every other confrontation with his mother, it ended with Ethan's reluctant surrender. The cafe was filled with the soft, nostalgic sounds of a Cantonese ballad. Outside, the spring sun was warm. Ethan felt drowsy. The woman sitting across from him was talking at length about her requirements for a partner. She stated that a car and a house were non-negotiable, not because she was materialistic, but because they were standard expectations. She then brought up his time studying abroad, asking why he hadn't considered immigrating. Ethan stirred his coffee with a half-smile. He explained that, with the current housing prices and his meager $5,000 a month salary, buying a home was out of the question. Besides, their family apartment, while old, was conveniently located downtown, so a car wasn't necessary. As for studying abroad, he said it was just a chance to see the world. The job market overseas was competitive, so he came right back when he couldn't find work after graduation. He proposed that if he were to get married, the couple could save for a down payment and pay the mortgage together. Then he asked her what her salary was. The woman's expression stiffened. Eager to extricate herself, she quickly stated that she didn't earn much either, having just graduated. She insisted she wasn't ready to get married so soon anyway, and would prefer to date for a few years until her career was stable. Ethan readily agreed that they were probably not a match, explaining that his mother was eager for grandchildren. He then excused himself to use the restroom. He killed some time on his phone in the restroom. When he came out, The woman was already dressed to leave. She offered him a slightly apologetic smile, claiming a friend had an emergency and she had to go. Ethan said it was no problem. Then, to sever any possibility of future contact, he added that they should settle the bill, but his digital wallet was empty. Could she pay first and he would transfer her the money later? He returned home and reported to his mother that the date had been a bust, then disappeared into his room. He habitually opened his social media feed, looking for any updates from Ken. The first thing he saw was a selfie posted by his blind date. The caption read, "Met a real piece of work on a blind date today, crying laughing emoji." He wasn't sure if she had forgotten to block him or posted it for him to see. He didn't care. He unfriended her and kept scrolling. Ken rarely posted. His profile picture was a discreet landscape photo. However, perhaps excited about being back in the country, he had been more active lately. A few days later, another post from Ken appeared, this time a link to an article about updates to an industry regulation. It was so dry it didn't even warrant a like. Ken's social media presence was like the man himself, straightforward and without embellishment. His posts from his years abroad were sparse, mostly related to his studies, internships, or holidays, likely just to let family and friends know he was doing well. There wasn't a single photo of him alone, let alone with a girlfriend. Ethan was certain that a man as handsome, intelligent, and well-off as Ken wouldn't be single in a society where such men were in high demand. As for the possibility of Ken being gay, Ethan dismissed it as a less than 1% probability, not even worth fantasizing about. After all, back in high school, he had helped Ken cover for dates with his girlfriend. It was their senior year. The pressure of college entrance exams was a palpable, tightening force. One evening during study hall, the quiet rustling of paper was broken by the sound of suppressed sobs. It was Freya, the girl who sat in front of Ethan. She was the class's arts and culture representative, talented, popular, and beautiful. Her crying immediately drew the attention of half the class. Ethan instinctively glanced toward Ken's desk. Sure enough, the class president was already walking over, asking in a low voice what was wrong. Freya just cried, refusing to speak. Finally, she stood up abruptly and ran out the back door. The room buzzed with whispers. Ken, after a moment's hesitation, told Freya's desk mate he would go find her and to tell their teacher, Mr. Davis, that she was feeling unwell if he came by. Ethan raised an eyebrow. A male classmate accompanying a female student to the nurse's office for feeling unwell was a flimsy excuse. As if sensing Ethan's unspoken skepticism, Ken turned and their eyes met for a brief, charged moment. Ethan quickly looked away. Near the end of study hall, Ken and Freya returned. Freya seemed to have composed herself, though her eyes were still red. As she packed her bag, she made a point of waving cheerfully at Ken, who smiled and nodded back. Ethan told himself he was being ridiculous, paying such close attention to their silent exchanges. After the bell, most students left quickly, but Ethan stayed behind to finish his chemistry worksheet. The classroom emptied, leaving only the quiet scratch of his pen on paper. He was so focused that he jumped when a voice above him said he had made a mistake on the previous step. He looked up. It was Ken, the only other person left in the room. Ken pointed to an equation on his paper, explaining the error. Then he said he wanted to ask him for a favor. Ken explained that Freya was struggling with math and physics and was incredibly stressed about her falling grades. He wanted to tutor her. Ethan, his mind still processing, simply asked what that had to do with him. Ken grinned. "You're the top physics student in our class," he said. "What do you think?" Ethan was bewildered. He and Ken moved in different social circles. Ken's own physics grades were excellent. Why was he being roped into this? but he found himself agreeing. A few days later, the school rumor mill was churning with news that Freya and Ken were dating. The gossip eventually reached Mr. Davis, who, despite his trust in his star student, felt compelled to have a word with Ken. In the teacher's office, Ken calmly explained that he wasn't the only one helping Freya. He pointed to Ethan, who happened to be dropping off homework, and said that Ethan was tutoring her in physics. Mr. Davis was shocked. It was completely out of character for the rebellious Ethan to volunteer to help a female classmate. Ethan, catching on instantly, played along, confirming their story. In reality, he had attended only 2 tutoring sessions before giving up, unable to tolerate Freya's slow grasp of the concepts. Ken had apparently taken over both subjects himself. After being dismissed from the office, Ethan caught up with Ken in the hallway. He asked with a smirk how Ken planned to thank him for being his alibi. Ken smiled back, asking what he had in mind. Just then, Freya appeared, offering Ken a boba tea she had smuggled into school. Ethan just shrugged and walked past them. "No need to thank me," he said over his shoulder, as Freya's voice chirped behind him, asking Ken if he wanted to see a movie that weekend. The fallout from Ethan's sabotaged blind date was swift. His mother, livid that her face had been lost in front of her former boss who had arranged the meeting, unleashed her fury on him. She accused him of being duplicitous and ungrateful. Ethan, knowing he had gone too far this time, accepted the tirade without argument. But his silence only enraged her further. She accused him of never listening, of being stubborn and arrogant his whole life. It was a familiar speech, but one phrase always cut the deepest. Never listening. He couldn't hold it in any longer. He retorted that he wished she had never tried to do what was best for him, that he wished he had been stubborn and arrogant from the start. The words tumbled out, angrier than he intended, fueled by a deep, buried well of regret. "If I hadn't listened to you back then," he stopped himself, swallowing the rest of the sentence. The air in the room grew thick and still. He was horrified to realize how much he hated the choices he had made, so much so that he was about to blame his parents for his own life. His mother, trembling with rage, accused him of being just like his father, an ungrateful wretch. The fight drained him completely, leaving him with a profound sense of defeat. The war of words was a battle no one could win. The subsequent Cold War with his mother left Ethan's mood volatile. His colleague Chloe described him as a powder keg, ready to explode at the slightest touch. And someone was about to light the fuse. The L train was packed. Ethan was holding onto a pole, scrolling through his phone, when he noticed a man furtively reaching into an elderly man's coat pocket. Without a second thought, he yelled out, "What do you think you're doing?" The sudden shout startled everyone. The thief, caught off guard, brazenly met Ethan's glare. "What's it to you?" he snarled. Ethan's anger flared. He pointedly asked what the man's hand was doing in someone else's pocket. The elderly man checked his pockets and, finding nothing missing, shrank back into the crowd, silent. Seeing no one else stepping up, the thief grew bolder, spewing insults at Ethan. Ethan's temper snapped. He pushed through the crowd, ready to confront the man, but the lurching train caused him to stumble. A heavy fist slammed into his back. He turned to see 2 other menacing-looking men closing in on him. They were a team. One of them, a heavy-set man, threatened him for being a meddler. The other passengers instinctively backed away, creating a small arena. The elderly man he had tried to help had vanished. A surge of cold fury washed over Ethan. He swore and threw a punch at the heavy-set man. The car erupted in screams. It was 3 against 1 in a cramped space, and Ethan quickly took several blows. but he had been in enough fights in his youth to know to focus on the weakest link. He zeroed in on the original thief, ignoring the other two as he relentlessly attacked him. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt. The doors flew open, and the conductor's voice boomed over the intercom, announcing the stop and threatening to drive directly to the nearest police station if the fighting didn't stop. In the ensuing rush of passengers getting off, Ethan was separated from the three men, who shouted a few last curses before disappearing out the rear doors. He pulled himself up. His thick coat had cushioned most of the blows, but his head was throbbing, and his lip was split and bleeding. A young woman with a child handed him a pack of tissues. He refused the offers of a seat from a few older women, thanked the woman for the tissues, and checked his phone. His perfect attendance bonus for the month was gone. Not only was he late, but he ran directly into Joyce as she was heading out of the office. She took in his disheveled appearance, then pointedly looked at her watch. She reminded him in a glacial tone that this was a place of business and walked away without giving him a chance to explain. Ethan slumped into his chair, a heavy sigh escaping his lungs. Chloe peeked over the partition, asking if he'd gotten into a fight. He just grunted in response, in no mood to talk. He spent the morning numbly working. It wasn't until his lunch break that he checked his phone and saw a startling number of notifications. He had been added to a group chat named Northwood High Class of '06. He barely had any contact with his high school classmates. The only two on his contacts list were a guy whose father worked with his mom and Ken. A quick scan of the group members revealed Ken was the one who had added him. Yet Ken hadn't sent him a personal message. It was as if he had just mass-added everyone he could find. Ethan told himself not to be so dramatic. With a wry smile, he added Ken to his old elementary school group chat, which had a ridiculous name. Then he added the other classmate to the high school group. He messaged Ken, "A favor for a favor. That's our elementary school class chat." Ken replied almost instantly, "Is the name because we were in classroom too?" Ethan, "Yes." He explained it was from their last reunion. Ken, "I heard about that one but couldn't make it back. They were asking for your contact info in the high school chat, by the way. Turns out I was the only one who had it. Did you lose touch with everyone?" Ethan explained that he'd lost his old phone number and accounts after moving abroad. Ken, "Oh, Freya set up this new group. You remember her, right?" The name hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He sent back a generic emoji and switched over to the high school chat. It was buzzing with activity. He scrolled back, but new messages were flooding in too quickly. He gave up, changed his display name, and went back to lurking. Freya was the most active member, her profile picture a stylish selfie. She was teasing a male classmate about an embarrassing high school incident. Ethan watched the playful banter, a detached observer of a past that felt increasingly distant. The reunion was set for the end of the month. As the initial excitement wore off, the chat's activity dwindled. Ethan rarely spoke in the group, sometimes muting it for days. But then he saw a notification. Someone had tagged him. It was Ken. He had been tagged multiple times. Scrolling up, Ethan saw Ken defending him in a debate about who was the most popular guy in their class, mentioning Ethan's legendary full marks in physics and the rumor about him receiving dozens of love letters on Valentine's Day. Ethan frowned. What was Ken playing at, trying to drag him into the fold? He didn't reply directly, but he made a point to participate in a few other conversations over the next day, just to show he was present. Ken didn't tag him again. The thought meddler flashed through Ethan's mind, sharp and irritating. Ken had always been a meddler. Ethan remembered one rainy afternoon in elementary school when his father was late picking him up. Ken, who lived nearby, saw him waiting alone and offered to stay with him. Ethan, bored, had agreed. But instead of playing, Ken had pulled out his homework and earnestly suggested they study together. By the time his frantic father arrived an hour later, he found his usually hyperactive son quietly doing math problems. From that day on, Ethan had consciously avoided Ken. They were, and always had been, from different worlds. Ethan had been considering quitting his job since the day he started. He felt like he was on the wrong path, a path that diverged long ago from where he was supposed to be. But he didn't know what else to do. His mother, of course, was against the idea, calling him flighty and unwilling to face hardship. Their conversation, like so many others, ended with Ethan retreating to avoid a fight. One Friday evening, he was at the supermarket picking up cooking oil for his mother. He saw a young woman in high heels struggling to reach an item on the top shelf. At that moment, a small boy ran headlong into her, sending her stumbling backward. Ethan instinctively reached out and caught her arm, steadying her. She turned to thank him and froze. "Ethan?" she asked, a look of joyful surprise on her face. He recognized her then. It was Sarah Wong, a classmate from high school who had undergone a stunning transformation since graduation. They marveled at the coincidence, exchanged numbers, and chatted for a bit. She was warm and direct, admitting that she had been too shy to add him in the group chat because he seemed so different now, so cool and distant. Before they parted, she insisted on taking a selfie with him, asking if she could post it. He agreed, joking that she should remember to Photoshop him too. The photo immediately caused a stir in the group chat. People teased them, asking what was going on. Ken's name appeared in the flurry of comments, a simple repetition of the nickname everyone had started using, Ethan the Great. Ethan saw it and nearly spit out his water. "Ethan, are you mocking me? Ken the Great?" Ken wouldn't dare. A playful debate erupted over who was more handsome in high school. The lighthearted banter, the shared memories, the easy camaraderie. For the first time, Ethan felt the knot of resistance in his chest loosen. The thought of the reunion no longer filled him with dread. The day of the reunion arrived. The location was a karaoke bar near their old high school. As Ethan got off the bus, the familiar sight of the school gates and the students in their uniforms filled him with a strange mix of nostalgia and relief that those days were over. He saw Ken standing near the school entrance, looking up at the building. As if sensing his presence, Ken turned and saw him. A slow smile spread across his face. "What a coincidence," he said. Ethan walked over, and they stood together for a moment watching the students. Ken remarked on how fast time had flown. Ethan teased him for being sentimental. The topic of conversation drifted to their time abroad. Ken asked about his studies in the UK, but Ethan, unwilling to discuss his past, quickly changed the subject, suggesting they head to the party. Ken noticed the deflection but didn't press, simply agreeing and falling into step beside him. When they arrived at the karaoke bar, the private room was already buzzing with a handful of early arrivals. They were greeted with cheers. Ken was immediately swamped by old friends, while Ethan found himself feeling like an outsider. The faces were familiar but changed by time, creating a disconcerting gap between memory and reality. He signed the guestbook Freya had prepared, writing a generic, non-committal message. Ken signed his name right below Ethan's and simply wrote, "Same as above." The playful gesture drew laughter from those watching. Freya arrived, dressed down in a simple white shirt and jeans. She greeted Ken warmly, and he handed her a small black box, a lipstick she had asked him to bring back from his trip. The easy familiarity between them sparked another round of teasing about their long-standing connection. Freya explained that they had reconnected when she was an exchange student in the same city where he was attending university. Ethan watched them, a feeling of boredom creeping in, and found a quiet corner to sit by himself. Later, when more people had arrived, Freya proposed a game. Everyone would submit a question they wanted to ask a classmate into a temporary group chat. She would then send a red envelope packet, and based on the amount of money each person received, they would ask and answer questions in descending order. The questions ranged from the mundane, "What's your job?" to the outrageous, "If you were drugged and had to pick one person in this room to help you, who would it be?" Ethan's luck was as bad as ever. He received the smallest amount, meaning he would be last. The game proceeded, with laughter and embarrassing revelations. When it was Ken's turn, he was asked a surprisingly philosophical question. If he had to give up one of love, ideals, or health, which would it be? After a moment of thought, Ken answered, "Love." His reason was simple. Without health and ideals, love would be meaningless. The answer was so earnest it momentarily quieted the room. Ethan felt a strange pang. Finally, it was the second to last person's turn. The remaining questions were the drugged scenario and what is the darkest thought you've ever had? The person before Ethan chose the latter and gave a weak answer about wishing his academic rivals would fail their exams. Dissatisfied, the group demanded a better answer, but he opted to pay a penalty instead. Ethan, facing the last two questions, did the same. But just as they were about to start a new round for the newly arrived Sarah, Ken spoke up. He reminded everyone that Ethan still hadn't answered the last question. Cornered, Ethan had to answer the drugged scenario. He expressionlessly pointed to the guy who had submitted the question and said, "Him. You brought this on yourself." In the second round, Sarah was asked which male classmate she had liked most in high school. Without hesitation, she smiled shyly and said Ethan's name. Later, as the group walked to a nearby hotel for dinner, Sarah fell into step with Ethan. She asked if she had startled him with her confession. He admitted he was surprised, as they had barely spoken in high school. She then reminded him of a time in music class when he had noticed her skirt was stained and discreetly given her his jacket to tie around her waist before anyone else saw. He had completely forgotten the incident. She confessed that it was small moments like that, an unexpected act of kindness, that can make someone fall in love. Ethan was moved by her candor but didn't know how to respond. At dinner, Mr. Davis, their old teacher, made an appearance. The students all rose to greet him warmly, but Ethan hung back, a wave of shame washing over him. He had never once visited his favorite teacher after graduation, feeling he had failed to live up to the man's high expectations. But when he finally went to greet him, Mr. Davis clapped him on the shoulder with genuine affection, scolding him good-naturedly for being a stranger. He told Ethan that one exam didn't define a person and that he was foolish for letting it keep him away. The words felt like a heavy weight being lifted from his shoulders. After the dinner wound down, Ethan decided to take the bus home rather than wait for an overpriced rideshare. As he walked, a white Audi pulled up beside him. Ken was at the wheel. He grinned and offered him a ride. In the car, they fell into an easy conversation about cars and life. The comfortable atmosphere was broken when Ken, his expression suddenly serious, asked Ethan if he ever regretted it. Not taking the guaranteed admission scholarship to a top university. Ethan was stunned by the abrupt shift in topic. He admitted that he didn't know. The scholarship was for a major he hated, and he had been arrogant enough to think he could get into his dream school on his own merit. Ken looked at him intently. "No," he said quietly. "You would have taken the exam again. The you I knew back then would have." The conviction in Ken's voice left Ethan speechless. Did Ken know him better than he knew himself? Or was he just referring to a version of Ethan that no longer existed? Ken seemed to realize he had overstepped, apologizing for being presumptuous. Ethan brushed it off, pointing out that the light had turned green. He leaned back and closed his eyes, lulled by the motion of the car and the soft country music on the radio. He woke up when the car stopped. They were in front of his apartment building. Ken was sitting quietly, watching him. As Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt, Ken reached over and straightened his collar, his fingers brushing against Ethan's neck. The small, enclosed space suddenly felt airless. Ethan thanked him for the ride and moved to get out. "Wait," Ken said. Ethan paused, his heart skipping a beat. Ken pointed to the side mirror. "Watch for the bike." An electric scooter whizzed past. Ethan felt a flush of embarrassment. He got out of the car and waved. Ken rolled down the window. "We should play basketball sometime," he called out. Ethan felt the crisp night air clear his head. He smiled, a genuine smile this time, and stuck his hands in his pockets. "Yeah, let's do that," he replied. "See you around." As he walked toward his building, the smile faded from his face. He let himself into the apartment. The living room light was on. His mother was at the table with several pillboxes. She asked coolly if he was back. He grunted a yes. She asked how the reunion was, who was there. He told her it went well, that Mr. Davis had come. She nodded, a faint, condescending smile on her face, as she asked about the son of a former colleague, what he was doing now. The brief warmth of the evening evaporated, leaving behind the familiar, suffocating chill of home.